Hello, welcome to Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us. Today's lecture, The Socratic Method, a Timeless Thinking Tool. I hope everyone's enjoyed the series so far. We've certainly covered a lot of ground, having gone over the basics of critical thinking, having taken an in-depth look at the intellectual virtues, and even having an interview with Benjamin Moss, the core creator of this lecture series. But we still have a lot of ground to cover. For the next two lectures, we're going to be looking at the Socratic Method. Now, the Socratic Method is so important because it really marks the beginning of critical thinking as a formal discipline. So it'll be worth our while to spend a little time on unpacking what it is precisely. Today, we're going to look at the Socratic Method from a very high level, so we won't be going into the details too much. We'll reserve that for the next lecture. But today, we'll be looking at the origins of the Socratic Method. We'll be looking at the key principles involved in the Socratic Method. And then finally, we'll look at where we can apply the Socratic Method in our lives today. So let's get started. Before we can really start talking about the Socratic Method, we have to look at the person that developed it, which means we have to look at the life of Socrates. Unfortunately, or fortunately for you, this means you have to listen to me pontificate about Socrates, and I'll try to keep this to a dull roar here, but Socrates is an extremely important figure, not only for critical thinking, but for philosophy in general. Unfortunately, though, we actually don't know that much about his life. He didn't leave anything of written record. Instead, he lived the philosophy that he developed. He didn't capture it in words, but lived it. So what we know about Socrates comes from his peers, and specifically from one of his pupils, the Greek philosopher Plato, who, if you've ever heard of him, is no slouch in his own right as a philosopher. There are a couple of important dates that we have that mark moments in his life. From the beginning, we know that his father was a mason, and so we know that he spent probably his teenage years at least working as a mason, as a craftsman. And this will become important later when we start to look at the Socratic Method in detail. We also know that several decades later, in his 40s, he fought in the Peloponnesian War, and that according to his peers, he was actually a very good soldier. And then finally, we know that he was put to death in his 70s for, quote, corrupting the youth, unquote. Less important, but nevertheless interesting, Socrates the man was apparently physically a bit, as my grandpa would have said, a bit homely. So he's known for having had bulging eyes and a snub nose and a pot belly. And he was also known for being a little bit stinky. Now, I don't assume any of you would necessarily know the nature of traditional Greek dress, and I don't think it's that important. I just think these anecdotes are, if nothing else, at least entertaining. But men would traditionally wear what is known as a chiton, which would be something like a very short dress of sorts that would be belted around the waist. And then over the chiton, they'd wear a robe. And I actually can't remember the name of that robe right now, but it was very similar in fashion to a Roman toga. Anyways, it was common for men to sometimes forego the chiton and simply wear the robe. They would be more or less covered, so they weren't outright naked, but nevertheless, they were showing more skin, and this was done as a way to celebrate and to demonstrate the beauty of the male body. This was also very common for philosophers to do. They would forego the chiton and just wear the robe to demonstrate the nobility of their minds and their willingness to forego physical comforts. Socrates, of course, would do this as well. He would only wear his robe, but given the facts of his life, or at least his physical characteristics, what's so funny about this is that by living in this way, he was intentionally thumbing his nose at Greek custom and Greek tradition in favor of what he was demonstrating in his life, which was the life philosophical. So besides these very overarching key moments in his life, and besides these sort of entertaining facts about the man himself, we don't know that much else about Socrates except for what Plato offers us in his dialogues. And it seems that Socrates effectively spent his time, I like to say this to my students, trolling others. If you want to get a sort of contemporary understanding of who Socrates was essentially someone or something like an edgelord or a troll, like an internet troll. And I say this because he pretty much spent his days wandering around the marketplace and around the city of Athens, questioning his peers about various different topics of interest. Ones that weren't only interesting to him, but were interesting to the Athenian society in general. Of course, importantly for us, the way that he went about questioning his peers is what gave rise to what is now known as the Socratic method. So the Socratic method, in the most general terms, is simply a way of having a conversation with others. That's all it is. Pretty simple, at least on the surface. As we get into it, you'll see it's actually quite complicated, and that's why we need 2 lectures to get into it. But at the highest level, the Socratic method is merely a way of having a conversation with others. But of course, it's a conversation with a very specific purpose. So, importantly, what Socrates is after, as is anyone that asks a question, is an answer. However, for Socrates, he really wanted that answer to be couched in the truth. And he firmly believed that in order to do so, in order to discover an answer couched in truth, the conversation being had to proceed logically. And so while Socrates would absolutely ask open-ended questions, he wouldn't let his conversation partners get away with being illogical. So everything that they dialogued about was sacrificed on the altar of logic if it started to fall out of the realm of logical reasoning, or we can say critical thinking. So let's shift gears now and look at the key principles or key characteristics that are involved in this method that Socrates developed when he was conversing with his peers. Now, importantly, I want to note that I'm not talking about the process by which this method unfolded. I'm going to reserve that effort for the next lecture. But all I want to talk about here is just some of the key characteristics of that method. And really, for our purposes, there's 5 key principles. The first principle is that the Socratic method always proceeds by way of question and answer. Next, it always focuses on logical consistency. Third, in the process of doing the Socratic method, basic assumptions are uncovered. Fourth, the Socratic method almost always relies on concrete examples in order to clarify the topic on hand. And then finally, and quite important for our purposes, the Socratic method always proceeds within the spirit of charity. So let's look at each of these key principles in turn. First, I said that the Socratic method always proceeds by way of question and answer. Now, we've talked quite a bit about what it means to ask an open-ended question. And Socrates almost always asked open-ended questions, meaning he didn't know what the answer to the question would be, and he wasn't fishing for a certain answer either. Not often. Sometimes it seems like he was, but often he was asking open-ended questions such as, what does it mean to lead a good life? Or what is the true nature of justice? How does one balance one's soul? What does the perfect republic look like? And so on. These are very broad questions that really require a lot of conversation in order to unpack them. Importantly, these questions are open-ended in a way that almost presupposes that the only way to arrive at the truth is through cooperation. And this is really where the Socratic method shines, and why Socrates' example is so important to us today, is this belief. The truth is arrived at through cooperation. We can't simply come to know the truth by sitting in our rooms and perseverating on the question at hand. We have to come together to discover the truth. Next, Socrates was a stickler about logical consistency. We're going to get into what logical consistency entails after we talk about the Socratic method. But it's important to note that, at least for Socrates' purposes, reason was king during the conversations that he had. So if anyone was guilty of equivocating or drawing a false inference, he would absolutely point it out. He wouldn't, of course, be mean or pedantic about it. He would simply demonstrate the inconsistency to the person he was talking to, have them acknowledge it, and then give them the opportunity to reformulate what it is they were trying to say. But for Socrates, logical consistency was of paramount importance. Now, what inevitably seemed to happen is that in the process of having these conversations, Socrates would uncover the basic assumptions that his peers were making in that conversation. So what's so interesting about basic assumptions is that not only are they sort of simple in nature, but they're so basic to our thinking that sometimes we don't even recognize them, or we're not even conscious of them. And it's not until someone brings them to our attention that we realize, oh, this is something that I basically believe. I basically believe this is true. Well, sometimes our basic assumptions aren't true. And so the Socratic method is really good at drawing out those basic assumptions and allowing us to look at them and determine whether or not they're sound, and if we need to revise them or not. Now, earlier, I said that Socrates, when he was young, likely worked as a mason apprentice to his father, and I said that that was important. The reason it's important is a hallmark of the Socratic method is that it relies on concrete examples. So almost comically, in Plato's dialogues, Socrates constantly refers to specific craftsmen and the things they do in order to highlight a point he's making or to uncover a lack of reasoning on the part of his peers. And so, again, comically, Socrates would almost always be talking about coopers or horse trainers or cobblers or masons or any other such thing. But he did this not only for comical relief, but in order to bring the conversation to a level that everyone could participate in it. So it was very important for Socrates, and I think it's very important in general for critical thinking, that the conversation unfolds in a way that everyone is allowed to participate and is able to participate in the conversation at hand. And that's what those concrete examples served for allowing. Socrates' belief in using concrete examples is that if we talk about craftsmen as Athenians, everyone has a basic understanding of craftsmanship, why it's important and how it proceeds, because it's such a common and basic and important part of daily life as an Athenian. It was something so common that everyone was familiar with it, either through direct experience or at least as a consumer. But yes, it also served comic purposes at times, and Plato even alludes to this in several of the dialogues. And then finally, yes, the Socratic method proceeds in the spirit of charity. Now, I've sort of beaten this horse to death, but charity, just for the sake of thoroughness here, charity is approaching a conversation with the belief or with the understanding that you have something to learn in that conversation. So Socrates, importantly, approached every conversation he had with the belief, the firm belief, that he didn't know at all what it was he was getting himself into, but that the people that he was conversing with would know. The only thing that he was good at was ensuring that the conversation proceeded logically. And that's where arguably the intellectual virtue of skepticism came in for Socrates, is that he would not take anything anyone said for granted. He would fact check it against the principles of logic or the principles of sound reasoning to ensure that what this person he was talking to was saying made sense. And so we see right here, right in this example, why Socrates was so influential is that he really embodied the philosophy that he expounded upon. Or better, he expounded upon this philosophy literally by demonstrating it to others. So he embodied the intellectual virtues, and through his example, others came to understand what it meant to be virtuous in these particular ways. And just to drive this point home of Socrates' influence and impact, bear in mind that almost all of the Hellenistic schools that at least we know of on written record were essentially trying to capture and emulate Socrates' teachings and life. So that includes, for instance, Epicurus, the Stoics, the Cynics, the Peripatetics, and so on. All these folks were trying to capture Socrates' thinking and Socrates' life and systematize it in a way that others could adopt that way of life as well. Of course, we're quite a ways away from having systematized the Socratic method. Nevertheless, I think we can begin to talk about where we can apply the Socratic method in our lives today. And the answer is in several places. I won't go into too much depth because we're going to do that again in the next lecture. I promise we will get in depth here. But nevertheless, here are a few places that we can begin to apply the Socratic method. And the first, of course, is in one's personal life. So the idea here is that by utilizing the Socratic method, we can begin to develop and grow as individuals. And we do that by systematically questioning ourselves, exploring our basic assumptions, and of course, ensuring that as we're thinking through this entire process of self-reflection, we're being consistent in our reasoning. We can also use the Socratic method in the workplace. For example, if you're a manager or a team leader, by relying on questioning and answering, logical consistency, and so forth, what you'll end up doing is developing a culture of critical self-reflection and innovation. These are always good things in the workplace. I also imagine that the Socratic method could be used by parents. Now, I don't have children, and I know sometimes having a conversation with children is a never-ending game, but nevertheless, I do imagine that the Socratic method could be leveraged to good effect by parents when educating their children, or even vice versa when the child is trying to educate the parent. Of course, the child might not know how to educate the parent, but by being open, by being charitable, the parent allows themselves to be influenced and to learn from their child. And then finally, and this is merely a point of interest, the Socratic method is often utilized in therapy, actually. So if we look specifically at evidence-based therapy practices, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, these almost always proceed by way of question and answer, and the questions themselves are open-ended. So the therapist won't necessarily have a specific answer in mind that they're trying to coax out of you. It's an open-ended question and an invitation for you to reflect on that question for yourself. Something that I think would be very interesting, actually, is to explore the similarities between Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy, bearing in mind, of course, that Stoicism is a species of Socratic philosophy, whatever that might be. To understand how influential, beneficial, and salubrious philosophy is for us in our day-to-day lives. At any rate, I do firmly believe that the Socratic method can be leveraged in several areas of our lives, and maybe not, strictly speaking, as a full-blown conversation in pursuit of some answer or in pursuit of some truth, but we can break up the Socratic method and use some of its key principles in various aspects of our lives to our benefit. Now, as always, I want to leave you with a few reflection questions for you to consider on your own time. So my first question for you is, what do you think is the difference between the Socratic method, as we discussed it today, and debate, as you might have learned it in school? Second, what distinct advantages or disadvantages do you foresee in using the Socratic method in your personal life or in the workplace, etc.? Finally, do you actively employ the Socratic method in your life already? If not, would you benefit from doing so? If you already do, how has what you learned today augmented your employment of the Socratic method? So that does it for us today. We've took a very cursory look at the Socratic method, specifically looking at the origins of the Socratic method, the key principles or characteristics involved in the Socratic method, and then, of course, discussing how we might apply the Socratic method in our lives today. I do want to apologize. I recognize that the amount of time each lecture takes is varying quite a bit, and I'll try to do my best in the future to normalize the length of the lectures. But nevertheless, next week we'll be looking in depth at the Socratic method, and I hope you tune in. Thank you.